Okay, we're on Bikkurim Perek Gimel, Mishnah Zayin, 7th Mishnah and the 3rd chapter of Bikkurim. We're going to learn the Mishnah. The Mishnah actually is relatively straightforward, and then I'm going to use this as an opportunity to sort of jump, after we learn the Mishnah, into a halachic issue that we learn that jumps out straight from the Mishnah itself. So I'll tell you when we're done with the Mishnah, and you can turn it off, or you can continue to the end of the shiur. It's going to be a little longer than usual. Okay, the Mishnah is talking about Mikra Bikkurim. So in order to understand this Mishnah, we have to look at another Mishnah in Masechet Sota. The Mishnah in Masechet Sota says there's a bunch of things that have to be said b'lashon hakodesh. When you recite them, they have to be said specifically, okay, in Hebrew itself. So the first one, ve'elu ne'amarim b'lashon hakodesh, says the Mishnah, these must be said in Hebrew. Mikra Bikkurim. Mikra Bikkurim must be said in Hebrew. How do we know Mikra Bikkurim must be said in Hebrew? I mean, you can't recite a translation. Kriat Shema, you can say in any language. Okay, Shema b'chol lashon. Shemona Esrei, you can say in any language. But when you came to do Mikra Bikkurim, Mishnah says, Mikra Bikkurim Ketzad, how do we know that Bikkurim must be recited in Hebrew? Because it says, Ve'anita ve'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. This we have from we've seen this a bunch of times from our psukim. We say, Ve'anita ve'amarta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, Rami Oved Avi, etc. Okay, and later on it says, Ve'anu alevi'im ve'amru. And it says, V'anu alevim and raru, later on, where it's talking about, I think it's Har Grizim and Har Eva. So the Anu, they raise their voices and they say, Ma aniya amura lahalan b'lashon hakodesh. Just like one is b'lashon hakodesh in Hebrew, afkan b'lashon hakodesh. The Mishnah learns explicitly, in order to recite the Mikra Bikkurim, it has to be recited in Hebrew. So our Mishnah asks the obvious question, what if you don't know? What if you don't know Hebrew? So the Mishnah says the following. Rabbi Shona, originally, Kol mi sheyodeh likrot, koreh. Okay, anyone who knew how to recite Mikra Bikkurim would read. V'chol mi she'eni yodeh, and if somebody didn't know how to say it in Hebrew, likrot, makrin oto, they help him. So the Kohen would say, repeat after me. He got it, Arami, Obed, Avi. Because you just repeat after the Kohen. You would say, you would do whatever the Kohen tells you to do. What happened is, nimne'u lahavmi lahavi. People stopped bringing Bikkurim. Why? Bartuner says, mibnei habusha. Because they're embarrassed. They don't know how to recite Arami Oved Avi. You have a non-learned public. They don't all know the psukim perfectly. They can't all learn it exactly the way they're supposed to. They're not lettered people. They stop bringing Bikkurim. Therefore, the Mishnah says, Hitkinu shiyu makrin et mi sheyodea ve'et mi she'eino yodea. So they made a decree, sort of like a democratic, a decree for everyone, that they made a decree that they would read lakrot et, they would read for. I.e., they would be reading for it, because it says, V'anita v'amarta, ein aniya elim pi acher. The person would read for you and you would answer. I.e., shu makrin, not that you would say it yourself. Okay? I actually misunderstood it. I thought it meant, okay? Yeah, he would answer. So it's unclear. Do they read it for you and you read it with him? Okay? Because the Kahati says, Kari'in lefanav et haparsha, v'hu oneh achar hakoreh. They would read it and you would answer. You would respond after the person would read it. Okay? So they made a rule that they would do this for everyone, even the people that know and the people that don't know. And it's very interesting. We have a number of cases like that. Another example we know is tachrichim. People would leave their bodies, and the Mishnah says that if people didn't have enough money, that's why they couldn't bury their dead properly. They would leave them in the streets. They were embarrassed. So Chazal made a decree that only plain tachrichim, even the rich people. So here also, it's sort of like trying to find the lowest common denominator so that nobody should be embarrassed. Okay, that's the end of the Mishnah. It's a beautiful Mishnah. Chazal made a takana. We want everyone to bring Bikkurim, so we'll make sure that nobody's embarrassed. But it's very interesting. This immediately got me thinking of a halachic example of a case in halacha you may or may not be aware of. That's very similar. It seems to be very similar discussion, and that's the discussion of Kriat Hatorah. Okay, so as we all know, when a person gets an aliyah Torah, okay, the aliyah Torah says, okay, that we all know that when you get an aliyah Torah, you're supposed to read. The Aliyah Torah traditionally, and it's clear in Chazal, the Aliyah was the person, Ya'amod, Ruvain, Shmuvain, whatever, and he reads the Aliyah. Nowadays, nobody reads. So the question is, when did it become clear that people would not read for themselves? So it's actually relatively, halachically, not recent, I guess, in the times of the Rishonim. So it turns out it's a huge machloket between Tosfot and the Rush. Tosfot and Baba Batra say the following. How come only two people read the whole Torah? I don't know why they had two, I'm not sure. Meaning, why don't people, like the Teimanim do? Even today, why wouldn't the original people read their own aliyot? Omer Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Okay, Omer Rabbeinu, here we are. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, Kedei shelo yitbayesh mi she'eno יודע לקרוא. So that we don't embarrass someone who doesn't know how to read. Ki inyan shematzina b'Masechet Bikkurim, as we find in Masechet Bikkurim, our Mishnah, Hadith 9 that we learned in the Mishnah, Kol mi she'yodea likrot koreh be'atzmo, etc., etc. Nimnu lahavi. People stopped coming. Therefore, they hitkinu shiu makrin and kol mi she'yodea likrot. So they made a takana, just like so. The Tosfot said the reason why we have Baal Koreh read for everyone is because people stopped. They didn't want to be oleh because they didn't know how to read. Okay, so it's interesting. So the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel in Megillah disagrees. Did I make that here? I want it to be bold. Okay, and he says the following. He says, I don't think that that's the reason. Because who cares if people ain't a dimyon near with it? I don't think that's true. Tehatam nimnu lahavi bikurim v'avru amashakato b'Torah. People stop bringing bikurim, then Chazal have an interest, because then people are not fulfilling a mitzvah. Aval hacha bikiin yikru v'acherim yimneu. What's the problem? People who don't know how to read, so then they won't make a tikaliyot. They won't read incorrectly. Umachamata busha. Maybe if they're embarrassed, then they'll be careful and they'll read it properly. They'll learn it properly. So he says it can't be that we have a Baal Koreh because people stopped reading. So they don't have to read. Not everybody has to have an aliyah. Elanir hatam. He says to me, I think the reason is the fisha enakol b'ki'im b'tamei mikra. It's true, people don't know how to read correctly. And not everybody's going to be yosei. You might find this familiar from your experience. But he thinks he knows how to read. If they don't call me, he says, listen, give me an aliyah, I want to read. And the gabbai is like, I don't know, I can't. So then they're going to cause fights. So because it was causing fights, because the gabbai didn't want to call it, but the guy doesn't know how to read, and the guy thinks he knows how to read, so they said, you know what, forget the fights, we're not going to do the fights. It's not based on our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is an important example if Chazal wanted somebody to fulfill a mitzvah deoraita. But instead, it's in order to prevent people who didn't know how to read from trying to read. So it's interesting. So the Shulchan Aruch has a whole arichud. You can look it up in Orach Chaim and Kuf Lametet. I'm going a little long, okay? And he says it's interesting. One second. Mish eino yodeh likrot. Somebody who doesn't know how to read. Sarich limchot biyado shelo ya'aleh l'sefer Torah. You shouldn't call him to read in the Torah, okay? If you need him, okay, because there's nobody else. If you have a shliach tzibur and he knows how to read it, okay, so he says a shliach tzibur will read for him. And the Mishnah Berurah says, the shliach tzibur reads all the time. Why? Two reasons he gives. One, one, because you don't want to embarrass people who don't know how to read. That's Tosfot that we just saw. Based on our Mishnah. And there are also a lot of people who don't know how to read. And they want to read. And the tzibur is not biyosei. So the Mishnah Berurah says that this takana is a combination both of the reason of Tosfot based on our Mishnah and the Rosh who says it's not based on our Mishnah at all. It's interesting. In Yad Binyamin, a couple of years ago, Rav Hadaya put out a letter because there was this phenomenon of people getting called to the Aliyot in the Torah and they wanted to read. So he put out a letter saying he wanted to establish a minhag, and in our community, the Shliach Tzibur reads. And if you're called for an Aliyah, you take the Aliyah, but the Shliach Tzibur reads. And if you want to read from the Torah, sign up at the Gabbai and learn on your own, and then you can read as much as you'd like. We'll stop here. I know it went a little long. It was just an interesting sugya to me that it comes from our Mishnah, so I thought I would share it with you. We'll dedicate the learning to the memory of my father, Rav Simcha Bar Yitzchak Kalman, and you can email me at rspolter@gmail.com. Comments, questions, etc., etc. Have a great day.